Yeah, I have a lot to say, about the language element. I did my undergraduate degree in linguistics. I have a minor education in psychology. And one of the things that I've come to realize is this whole dialogue about, political correctness is really a fight over epistemology. So in French intellectual history, linguistics, really who they call the father of linguistics just in general in the whole European tradition is Saussure, Ferdinand
Mm.
Saussure. And he created what's become known as structural linguistics. And a later theorist who built off of that tradition, you had structural anthropology that got built off of that, but also Jacques Lacan, the famous psychoanalyst who reinterpreted Sigmund Freud. And one of his big theories on epistemology was he called it epistemological cuts.
Yeah, the
And
Aporels.
he was,
Aporia.
Michel Foucault took a lot
Yeah,
from him in his theories. But what Jacques Lacan was saying is that basically the first sign of epistemological change is that the semantic meaning behind a word shifts.
yes, yes, yes,
Okay. And
yes, yes,
that's
yes.
the cut.
Yeah,
And so we see this in the Islamic tradition from many words that existed in Jahiliyyah, all of a sudden being given new meanings with the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay. So, like salah, that word salah existed
yeah,
for praying
yeah,
to an idol before Islam, and it changed to have a specific fiqhi meaning,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
That was epistemological change that happened in, Meccan and Medinan society during that time. And I think one of the things that we haven't understood with that is that meanings of a lot of Islamic words, we, especially as Western Muslims, but even Muslims in the East, are starting to look through them through the prism of like the Western worldview.
But hold on a second. I want to pause there for a minute. I
Okay.
want to pause there for a minute to be fair. I think that we may have looked. I think the issue of looking at them through a Western worldview is worthy to pause on that point. But also, I think because we end up being from the East and the West at this point. Those of us who convert to Islam, we become international or
Right.
cosmopolitan in some way by experience. We travel, we understand languages. It's not just the issue. This is not just an issue of tourism.
We
Like
acculturate to different cultures in our local
yeah, yeah,
community.
yeah. So we have a different reality, and I wanted to pause to say that sometimes it's like Mutahiri, and Ali Shariati, and even Khomeini. They had understood certain Western concepts, but through translation.
Mhm.
And in the dialogue of civilizations, I think that the Muslims themselves don't always understand the West.
Oh,
And
for
so
sure.
and so there's a double take on these concepts. You know what I'm saying? There's the
Absolutely.
concept of how it's translated in, and then how it's understood later, which is maybe different than how it was initially intended. And so that you have these, like for instance, when it comes to the issue of the concept of nonprofit, or when it
Mhm.
comes to the issue of small business or store or business or participating in a community, it takes us back to the same conversation. I never forget from the Minbar, before all this stuff took place, before I came to the Chicagoland area, maybe about a year prior to, I had a long discussion with my community because I was an Imam Khatib in there, specifically the Palestinian community. And I had said that society is shifting now economically. And so there's a crunch on many people that are living in the inner cities because of gentrification and other things. And it's causing people to engage in certain types of activities. And recently there was a report even on the issue of carjackings, which police departments started to say that there's an increase in carjackings or surge in part due to the fact that youth are not going to school in the same way that they were. There's a social explanation.
They're trying to
So,
provide for their family.
yeah, yeah. And so this is something that I said that the concept, I said, one of the things I was trying to talk to specifically the community that I was addressing. And in this case, it was in part the Palestinian community. I said that, listen, during the riots, this particular area that we're in now, where the masjid is, there was riots there, the Glenville riots. We were about 2 blocks away from where Malcolm X gave his one of his famous speeches, the ballot or the bullet, because he did 2 of them. And I said that there was a store here, Vienna, it was Jewish owned. And I said that store during the riots was not burnt down. And I told them why. I said, because Vienna had a contract with the community. They would give the poor food. They would do certain things that helped them have street cred with the community.
That's what's up.
And this is what I was telling them. Like, so that concept of store, I was saying, you guys don't have that concept of store.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying? And so one of the brothers, who's a very beautiful brother, he said, look, I employ people. I've helped people. I have that. He got a little tense because I mentioned, the Jewish example. But that's not the case of everybody. So the idea becomes, what I'm saying is that when you start talking about how these ideas are understood, whether it's store or whether it's community relations or whether it's language, again, we don't have the narrative in place. And so when we start talking about understanding through a Western lens, when we unite the idea of advanced capitalism, which is about becoming a millionaire, doing your own thing, Atlas Shrugged, the Ayn Rand type of approach, this is Greenspan, he had built his whole philosophy of the Fed on Ayn Rand's philosophy. You understand what I'm saying? And so when we look at these realities, I think that the Muslims are adding their own dimension to some of the concepts that they look at, for instance, through what they call the Western lens. So to be more clear, what I'm saying is like, so you have this idea of materialistic capitalism. So they bring onto that the survivalist mentality of the third world that has been impacted by colonialism, right? And so when those things merge together, the worst of American society with the worst of whatever society is that they're coming from overseas, it could be from a number of different regions of the world, it doesn't create a position which is at the best. And of course, this is not all immigrants, but it's there. It's enough to be able to be identified, just like the Congress have their own issues. But here, you know what I'm saying? That's where, when you start talking about the colonial impact, that's why in some cases, like in these stores, there's no care, because it's like, I got screwed. I'm gonna screw over whoever screwed me and whoever else is in the way, because I got screwed and I have to make it in the world. You see what I'm saying? I'm here because I was forced to be here. My land was taken. So if I have to go into this inner city and I have to take it this way, I'm going to take it this way. And this is my right. You know what I'm saying? That's really, in many cases, what I feel is the underlying psychology. Huh?
Bullied becomes the bullier.
Yep. The bully becomes the bullier. So I think that the traditions, even Western traditions, even when we talk about Dewey, when we talk about Malcolm X, when we talk about the abolitionist tradition, when you talk about the issue of even the issue of, for instance, settlement, the gentrification now gives a new meaning to settlement. You know what I'm saying? The way that gentrification is going. I think all these ideas have to be re-examined. And again, we have to look at what it means to have mutual aid, solidarity communities, right? Because we've lost the basic minimum of social interaction, which means that we're violating at the level of human dignity. And I don't think that most communities will argue against the need to regard human dignity, right? And I think that that's the problem in policing right now. The question becomes, what is the element of human dignity? The economy, politics, what is the role of human dignity? Is the human being an object, or is the human being an end in himself or herself? And to be even to go on the edge, how we deal with people that we differ with, how are we recognizing them? I think that's the key issue. Our job, I think, is to articulate on those points. As a Muslim community, to be able to articulate on those points. Edward Said did it. Chomsky does it. There's a lot of intellectuals that do it. We're just not seeing Muslim intellectuals do it. Muslim intellectuals are not necessarily speaking to those issues.
It's very, very true. One of the things that has come to mind for me too, thinking about stores in the community, me and you both spent time in Egypt, and I think of the Egyptian corner store that's called the Ba'ala, right? Al Ba'ala. It's this store that's usually kind of just out in the open on the street corner, right? And you go there and, they treat you like you're just a friend, Zekahag, Zekabasha, they want to know how you're doing. They want to know what's new in your life. And they're like, hey, I'm about to make some dinner. You want to come sit with me? Let's eat dinner together. And this guy may be way poorer than you. And he's like, come on, let's have some ta'miyah. Let's have some falafel together. And he's just cooking it right there, kind of in the back.
I never forget. I used to have a store close to
that's humanity.
To me. And I never forget. You just reminded me of Umar. May Allah have mercy on his family for eternity. And I never forget that he used to. Where have you been? Because it wasn't just a store. It was the issue of a personal relationship, and that's actually good business.
Exactly.
It's good business, and corporate America. They do that, show your name, ask the customer, be invested in the customer. Where that's part of the Islamic.
Fake though.
Yeah, it's fake. And so, but I never forget that Umar, he always used to greet me. And then he used to read to me the ayah of the Quran. La udwan illa ala zalimin. And then it's just and then we used to do, basically business, what he want, from the store.
Mm-hmm.
But he used to tell me, basically there's no hostility or animosity except unto oppressors. And this is and that was it stayed profoundly. And he was authentic, because in many other instances I was being exploited in the economic relationship.
It's true.
Even there, that's what I was telling you, that environment also creates a very, exploitative set of relationships. It's not just here. It's
they're trying to get revenge on the colonialists. They see an American, that's what they think.
Yeah, however I can get it, I'm gonna get it.
Mm-hmm.
But they do it even to each other. That's done to each other, and this is where the social breakdown, in the Muslim community is very real. When you start talking about the issue of, for instance, how they exploit each other, the issue of rishwa, bribery. And basically it's more than bribery in some cases. It ends up being extortion, in some dynamics.
Yeah, or worse.
Yeah, I think that really, unfortunately, we're missing the point on where we should be at with the national dialogue. And I think this case of George Floyd is just making this really icky. And it's making it really icky. It's making it a law and order argument versus then how can we better the situation?
Exactly. The thing I was just going to say is one of the saddest things for me throughout this whole thing was to watch mostly suburban Muslims. All they wanted to talk about was looting. People are stealing stuff from Target and how haram that is. How could you be involved in that? This protest is ruined now. That was the attitude so many people had. And to be frank, it ruined a lot of friendships that I had. It made me view people in a totally different light. So, okay, someone got murdered. Someone got killed. Okay, and you're sitting here worried about looting? When people are getting shot up in the street, it's not about just George Floyd. In Minneapolis, we had a history too. Look at Philando Castile. We've been protesting this stuff for years. This ain't nothing new. We've done all your regular protests, how the white people want you to protest. We followed all the rules. We camped out of the police station with Philando Castile for a long time. Camps right outside the precinct. Camps. People spending the night beating drums every day. Okay. Nothing happened. Then George Floyd happens, right? No change. And then George Floyd. We were at our wits' end. We're like, okay, all this stuff that you tell us to do clearly ain't working. All right. It's a pandemic. People are suffering economically. I mean, I've seen a lot of my friends, they've been suffering really, really. Some of them became homeless. Like, and you're worried about them like taking a couple of things out of Target. The same Target who let the police use their building and use their parking lot as a base for their vans to drive around, have these paramilitary people jump out and spray us in the face with tear, or not tear gas, but the pepper spray, and to shoot us with rubber bullets. They're complicit. They're helping the police against us. And so what if we want to go take some revenge? I'm not advocating that that's the right thing to do, but like, is that really where your mind and your concern is going instead of people dying? I mean, it just shows like where your state of mind is.
That's why I was saying the issue of human dignity,
right,
is something that is is a point that is not central to most of our discussions.
Is property more important than human beings?
I think that's where we're at on all fronts, even for the religious community.
Commodified the human?
Yeah, I think that's where we're at. I actually think that that's where we're at.
I mean, we need to reflect on that.
I think that what has happened is that we have internalized that, even as religious communities. We see religious scholars that way. What is it that you're producing for us? We see marriage in that way. What am I getting out of it? What do I want? We see, relationships that way. Let me make a connection between this group and that. Let me go to this school because of this name and that. It's all transactional, and it's all commodified.
I mean, have we learned nothing from the American legacy of the transatlantic slave trade? I mean, really? Is that what
I think that the slave, Cornel West and others, Cornel West and I believe right now he calls it niggerization. That the whole of the community is being niggerized. Some people may not like the term, but it's a description of the reality, regardless of color, race, sex. Is something that is happening where the commodification of the human being is leading to exactly that, levels of exploitation in our interpersonal relationships. You know what I'm saying? That signify that we have that the human dignity is not valued. Edward Said, he talked about this years back. He talked about the problem of Palestine being one essentially of human dignity, in the sense that he said that the Arab leaders, how they dealt with that problem was not invest in the human being and the society. They went initially to military struggle. And so basically at the end of the day, what that meant was that they bankrupt their own communities. They created living conditions which there was no, they were not living conditions of justice. Their fight under the whole concept of let's address the Palestinian issue, it actually became a suppression of their own people. You know what I'm saying? They suppressed their own people more and more until we got to the Arab Spring. And that, at the end of the day, has led to the basically annihilation of Palestine off the map. So the human dignity thing is massive. This was a problem with Nazi Germany. You understand what I'm saying? This was a problem that, remember that Prussian society, and you're a historian, remember that Prussian society was at the peak of material civilization for themselves in Europe. And so when it collapsed, Nazism came up, but the framework was already being built up with the idea that Nietzsche was putting out in philosophy. Even Heidegger was already documenting, that stuff. Hegel, even the concept of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, it was never a full discourse on human dignity as a whole. It was the concept of human dignity for the select few. It wasn't even for the whole of the society, because they were still struggling with the issue of what is the role of women and others. And then now we just had this politician which is talking recently about women being witches. Did you see that? Right up. So, and they should be burnt, So, it's an insanity that we're going into. A clear insanity in political rhetoric, social rhetoric. It's a point where I personally feel that the human dignity point, it is the point where we can all agree on having a solid discussion. It's a universal constant, but it's missing. That's why you don't find, even humanism, even though maybe as Muslims, we have nuanced positions on humanism, but humanism is no longer part of the discussion.
No.
The human being is no longer part of the discussion. That's why this case right now, the George Floyd case, is really disturbing in that regard. It's disturbing because what it's basically saying is that no matter how much the people have spoken, we're having a trial to try basically a dead man. And we're not willing to acknowledge that the issue of human dignity was violated. It's not, it wasn't only George Floyd, but all of us, as a society, because the issue of public execution, that means anybody can be executed in public without a trial.
Yeah, it's the traditional lynching, just in a new form. That's really what's happening all across the country. There's absolutely no dignity in this situation. And to me, what comes to the forefront of my mind is, the Maqāṣid ash-Sharīʿa, right? Preservation of deen and life. That's like supreme. And that's something I think the Maqāṣid ash-Sharīʿa, these big kind of guiding principles for us ethically that pretty much all the religions sort of agree on, right? I feel like these are principles that we can unify with non-Muslims quite a lot in trying to call for social change, trying to make a society that's more beneficial for all of us,
Right. And I think that is kind of, the beginning point of the conversation. And I think that's the takeaway. Like, how do we build a society that's beneficial for all of us, despite our differences? Mm-hmm. I think that's the project. And I think that's going to be where our survival is at and our growth. Outside of that, I don't see anything except tension and strife and this volatile situation becoming worse.
And by saying, I feel like a lot of American Muslims look at things too much through a Western lens unknowingly. I'm not trying to assign blame to anybody. What I'm trying to do is encourage.
That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to remove that. I want the Muslims to take responsibility. That's why I was taking that position.
I want us to just kind of be encouraged to say, hey, there's a lot of stuff in our tradition that we can go look at in regards to this. That's accessible. That's even been translated into English. That we can go take a look at. Alchemy of Happiness, 2 volumes in English. There are things that we can go access in our tradition. We could do like a traditional historical genealogy, as Talal Asad calls it, and we can dig in the toolbox and find things to help us in the here and now. Because a lot of social issues, they repeat. They might not repeat in the exact same way, but they repeat. And so they've been talked about, in our tradition in the past. It's the Islamic worldview kind of looks at time in almost a cyclical manner, right? History repeats itself, as the saying goes, right? And, police brutality or overstepping your bounds in authority, or even like the Mu'tasib guy in the market who's kind of in charge of controlling and monitoring the market, they've overstepped their bounds. There's court cases that are documented in our history. There's ulama who have wrote about how a muhtasib should act. We have things like that in our tradition that we can look at, that we can do some ijtihad, some PS, istihsan, or whatever it is in our toolbox to go and address these issues, right? And I feel like, the recent research from Sami Ayyub, in terms of the late Hanafi tradition in the Ottoman Empire, shows that, Ibn Abidin's son was working with the Ottoman officials, and they created what was known as the Mujalla, okay, which was like the Ottoman code, legal code, which was a way of bringing, Islamic fiqh in concordance with all of these new issues suddenly we're facing with Western modernity. And I feel like that legacy is almost forgotten amongst, many Muslims nowadays, especially Muslims in the West. We can look at these things going on.
Muslims in the West are not versed in that stuff. Where that's not their main priority. There are people that has been cut off. Dr. Khalid Abul Fadl talked about that as a problem, and he claimed that he had went to some of the top historians at Princeton, and when he was studying there, and he was trying to see if there was a precedent for any people that has cut off his own tie into history and has survived. And that was a question that was, of pertinence and concern to him. But I think that the imitation to the imitating others, and the Mujalla, that concept also displaced scholarship, because what it did, it was automated scholarship to many in many senses. It basically stopped a certain process of ijtihad. Although what it did of benefit later on is it created a fecund or fertile ground for lawyers. And that's why there's a lot, like, for instance, Dr. Hussein, Yaqub Hussein, who's a master of the study of Qawaid from the scholars of Iraq. He's in Saudi now. I think he's still alive, except he was talking about how some of because he was being asked what is the most efficient or effective way to study usul al-fiqh. And he was saying that a lot of the writings that have come from the lawyers that study Qanun, Sharia Qanun, that the level of clarity that they provide, has been something that has been awesome. And I think also because some of those lawyers, they're dealing with everyday reality, whereas some of the scholars are not dealing with, legal realities in the same way. They're dealing with technicalities in books.
They might have Dar al-Ifta where they're talking to people, but maybe that's as far as it goes, right?
Yeah, that's as far as it goes. And so there's no tanfeed, there's no way to implement or execute that issue that they bring up as a verdict. And so I think that the Majalla, we need to talk about that the role that a lot of these studies have taken is how do you implement the concept. That was I had actually reached out to Dr. Hatem al-Hajj, because he, on his Facebook page, because he had talked about the work that Amjad did, which some of our teachers were on there. They worked on the whole family code. And I said, yeah, but how do you implement this stuff? You can't implement it. You should have focused on, you guys need to go back to the table and lay out rules like the Majalla of how the Muslim lawyer or a legal system can consider where Muslims stand on marital issues, right? Because American courts also do take into consideration people's custom to a certain extent, if it's done right. And so that brings us to a lawyer,
and you can actually get a contract written up that recognizes the Islamic marriage contract stipulations. There are ways that if we engage lawyers with the ulama, we can actually do some stuff, put some stuff into action.
Yeah, and that's why I think that was the greatest achievement of what the Ottomans did. That it was the effect for people later on. But in their time period, it did not help them in many ways, I think. I think it just ushered in their own destruction, and it displaced the scholars. And it wasn't until scholarship found itself in the whole Sharia wa Qanun concept that it was rediscovered what role. Now, it's like, it is what it is, decline.
Muslims wanted. one of the things about Sami Ayyub's new book that kind of was revelatory for me was that
What's it called?
Well, I can't remember. I can Google it here real quick. But one of the things that I took from it is that even though the Ottomans were trying to, I guess, codify or regulate, law in a very kind of detailed fashion, like make it all streamlined and make it all one
Automated
system
almost,
process. Yeah, automated. Yeah. They, part of the reason they did that was because of the rise of the nation states. They wanted
yes,
to,
yes,
they
yes, yes.
translated this into French, into English, and sent them out to all the different countries so that with globalization and economic change, everyone coming to Ottoman Empire knows what the rules are. But what Sami Ayyub shows, so his book is called Law, Empire, and the Sultan, Ottoman Imperial Authority and Late Hanafi Jurisprudence. What he shows is that even despite this going on, and you also have Suhail Hanif, who got his PhD at Oxford, who's done research in this. Despite all this going on, the people who are outside of the official Hanafi system, who were also Hanafis like Ibn Abidin and the likes, were creating like vast amounts of progress in terms of ijtihad, in terms of theorizing about urf and taghyir, urf was zaman, like the change of, culture and times that we live in, and how do we do tajdeed with fiqh to renew it, but still hold on to the tradition, with this like famous poem, Sharh Uqud Rasim al-Mufti, and all these types of work that they were doing. The Ottoman establishment was paying close attention to this, and they would cite things and they would pull things and take things in when they were making their official legal code. So I feel like the ijtihad was still going on, but definitely there was also a level of marginalization by the people who were outside of that system, especially the people of other madhahib too. But there was cross-fertilization to a certain extent as well. So it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that even in hadith studies, Ahmed Shakir was using some of the codified text that were mapping out hadith that were constructed by the Orientalists. And so that opened up the door for hadith research, which eventually impacted people like Sheikh al-Albani and others. That's something that's not talked about, how that it created a certain, that conflict created a certain environment, conflict of cultures, created a certain environment that allowed new ideas to be born. The same thing with Sheikh Muhammad Abdu. Sheikh Muhammad Abdu's attempt to engage modernity, some people leave it at the level of the ta'wilat or the hermeneutical positions that he took or the explanations that he made of the Quran that were problematic, but it was way more than that. They were trying to integrate the printing press and relook at the tradition. And so they were re-examining the intellectual tradition. They were re-examining hadith tradition. They were re-examining the role of science. And so unfortunately, but again, because just like on these discussions that we were talking about earlier, this is coming back down to one thing that was mentioned before as being a time. Us not being familiar with epistemology and how to deal with the tradition, how to deal with knowledge in a simple way. You know what I'm saying? And how to deal with the changing time, the same thing when we start talking about, what Imam Ibn Abidin rahmatullahi alayhi was trying to attempt, or others, what the Ottomans were doing, it's because we don't understand knowledge in these fluid ways. And we don't understand the interdisciplinary, everyday connection that's there between knowledge, and the role of humans and so on and so forth. And that's why I said that I think that we're not going to be able to move forward until those people who have that insight, and unfortunately it comes back to individuals, they have dialogues that recapture this lost, aspect of the tradition, that the tradition of scholarship, not the tradition as being something that is stagnant, but the practice of scholarship is something that is interdisciplinary and is very related to time and place. That has been the way of the Muslim for a long time. And when it stagnates, we stagnate, right? Mm-hmm. Because then it's like outdated technology, that if you have a phone that's from years back, what you can do with it is extremely limited, and any sort of update that comes on it, is not going to be able to, embed itself. And so what that does is it gives you no access or limited access. And I think that that's where we're at.
Political stagnation is always tied to cultural stagnation.
Yeah, and that's why the cultural revolution is more important than anything else.
I agree.
The cultural transformation right now is the key for us, I believe.
Mm-hmm. For Muslims in the West, I totally agree. In the East, I can't comment enough on the situation.
The East is its own beast. The East is its own beast. Is its own issue. I think that's a complicated issue. It's beyond our boundaries of analysis. I mean, we can analyze what I'm saying. If we're going to take what we were saying about experience, and relevancy and regard for nuance, all that seriously, I think that becomes a hard one, even though, we may have some experience in the East. And they're not ready right now, I don't think, to even entertain these discussions because of what has happened with the Arab Spring.
It's difficult because, there's power structures in place that prevent these conversations from happening.
Right. And it's very easy for us in the U.S. to turn to that as well. With the role of the public intellectual and what it means, these platforms, what do they mean? That you can be taken into account for what you have said through recording. What does, we can, where does constitutional law apply and where it doesn't apply? That's kind of because, we're dealing with now the onslaught of the privatization trend. And so a lot of our forums are no longer public forums. They're private forums in which the Constitution and the law doesn't apply in the same way, whether it's the workplace or whether it's Facebook or Google or whatever it may be.
Here's your free speech zone. Go protest over there.
Yeah. Are you on the sidewalk or not on the sidewalk?
Right.
Where you're protected at. It's a weird time in American law, actually.
Very.
In that regard, the idea of the what is it that they called it, the community hall, the concept of the community hall where everybody's collected together to talk about community affairs, is pretty much a gone or dead idea.
When they were doing jury selection for George Floyd's trial, there was a Black man who was, kind of being like interviewed for this process, right? And there was a lawyer who did like an analysis of this, the trial later on, who said like, it's totally illegal to bar somebody based on race from, like serving on a jury. But what they'll do is that guy who'll be asked questions and he'll give his answer from his Black experience, his life experience being Black, living in Minneapolis. And they'll go, oh, he's biased. He has a bias against the police. He has a bias against that. He has a bias against that. And they'll find that as a way to exclude him. Right? That's how things function in our society in general. These kind of like unspoken rules and ways of trying to keep the status quo, trying to push people down.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying to you earlier, it goes back, ties in, that I don't think a large portion of the Muslim community is ready to engage or entertain, a discourse or a series of discourses which are formulated to really deal with our situation. In other words, to talk about how Islam applies in our context. I don't think we're ready because of that issue, because a lot of us we're part of that process, that exclusion process. And so a lot of us have internalized that stuff. And so anything that goes against that, like I remember when, for instance, when Kenosha happened, when the killing in Kenosha happened, some brothers, they immediately were like, well, he should not have resisted. He should not have done this. He should not. They never looked at it outside of that context. You know what I'm saying? They never looked at it outside of that context. Immediately, it was an issue of conformity. Well, why didn't you? You're automatically wrong because you didn't conform to this. So they don't see that in themselves.
But look at Philando Castile. You can conform as much as you want. They still gonna kill you. Really. You can conform and listen to them as much as they want. If that cop decides to be a mean, horrible human being, that's what he's gonna do. You know what I mean? And have you ever had a gun pointed at you and feared for your life? You don't know how you're gonna react. Adrenaline kicks in, all these chemical things happen in the body. You don't become a rational person. You're in fight or flight mode. It's up to the cop. It's up to the person in power to say, hey, let's de-escalate things. However that person reacts, you can't blame them for that, like in that way. Sure, there's right and wrong, but you're in a life and death situation. You got someone being aggressive with you who's got a deadly weapon, the police officer. Nobody knows how they're going to react in those situations. I remember when the protests were in the heat of things. I'm driving all over the state of Minnesota, going to protest in Mankato, going to protest in Minneapolis, going to protest in places, just different cities, Brainerd, Duluth, different places, right? All over the state. I got pulled over once. As soon as them sirens went on, I did not know there was a cop behind me. As soon as them sirens went on, my body jumped and my head hit the top of my car so hard. Like, you don't know how you react in these situations. That stuff scares you so bad. You could be jittery and nervous and freaking out, and the cop thinks, oh, he's nervous. He's trying to hide something. They become extra suspicious. Like, you know what I mean? It's really up to the person who has the power to be the de-escalator. That's the training that they give in Europe. They don't have all these police shootings. Even in Egypt, I've seen how the police operate there. A lot of times they're quick to de-escalate. But here we got a problem in America, And I feel like it's beyond just changing a policy here and there. I think we need to have a significant cultural change in our country, and along with structural change, to really do something about this issue of policing and power in the community.
Well, the reality is that policing has become a way for gun manufacturers to get off contracts as well.
Oh, for sure.
You know what I'm saying? So behind the scenes, it may not even really have anything to do with, the establishment per se in itself. It may have in part, we can say, which the establishment has its own issues. The institution of policing has its own issues. Mm-hmm. But the militarization of the police, that is not even, let's be honest, that's, also comes from lobbying power, on the part of the arms, industry, because they get their contracts off, and they put their influence onto the system.
Them same tear gas canisters being shot at us in Minneapolis are the same ones, a lot of these same weapons we find overseas. They're in the streets in Cairo. They're in the streets in Syria. Same company.
Yeah, that's where, that's really where the issue is at. And then, it's the social arrangements. I'm a firm believer at this point that, the way that we're funding our activities is in part was leading to the type of social organization that we have. And that it's a matter of reorganizing ourselves. And I think our problems will be a lot different. We need neighborhoods, we need jobs, we need a different value system that puts values on other things other than just consumerism. Consumerism and having money to just buy, or being in that race is in part was leading to a lot of these dilemmas. You know what I'm saying? Everybody's not going to be a millionaire or a billionaire, so that to think that lifestyle, that we all have to live that lifestyle, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a more equitable distribution of wealth. I'm not implying that by any means. But what I'm saying is that the materialistic capitalist ethic, as it is now. And that doesn't mean that there's no good things in capitalism, but the way that it's operating now in this form now is what's creating these relationships that we have to one another. Because it is, at the end of the day, we are still a society that's governed by law and order, whether that law is explicit or implicit, whether it is that, that unspoken code or that legal code. We still have a society of enforcement. It's not at the level of being a chaotic society with no law. It's a chaos which is there, is understood, is studied. You understand what I'm saying? And it's the consequence of certain actions that we have. We know the tendencies of those who end up going into certain criminal cultures. We know the lifestyle is documented. We have so much documentation on it. You know what I'm saying? So this is where we have to rethink what kind of societies do we want to leave to our children. And I don't think the consciousness of the nation is there, because the conscience of the nation right now is colonized by the interests of the few, and that's just the bottom line. The interests of the few are just interested in keeping that going. The testimony to that as being a reality or a good read of the situation is what happened during COVID. Every other country in the world supported its population on a monthly basis, and we were left to conditions that create hostility. You understand what I'm saying? And it's one thing, do you have a police shooting? It's another thing that you have conditions in this society that are ripe for uprising. You know what I'm saying? So those two, when they mix together, it's like dynamite. Dynamite that's ready to be lit, and that's what we were left to. And nobody has talked about accountability on that, because it would have been one thing that police shooting took place and people were stable in the society. We may have been able to address that in a different way, right? And some people will say, well, it had to be done that way. That's a different discussion. But what I'm saying is, like, at this point in time, the way that the society is arranged and handling its social issues is doing nothing but creating other social problems.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're continuing more and more and more and more. It's not anything that's put to an end. The pharmaceutical company, as far as I'm concerned, and had their hand of destroying a good portion of America and families, it got the same treatment that Derek is getting in the court system. Like, I don't know if there's really culpability or not. In other words, it's a technical slap of the hands. But in the meantime, there's casualties. There's casualties that are, the consequence of that type of behavior. And that comes from because we're so stressed out. The average American is so stressed out that you're not really able to participate in community.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that, capitalism as this modern system that emerged with Enlightenment and kind of Protestantism, things move together and other, historical factors. The thing about it is that it pushes us into, a type of way of life where we're only concerned with survival. We're only barely just surviving. We struggle, to feed ourselves, to house ourselves, to clothe ourselves. And we busy all of our time with that, and we can't take care of each other because of that system. It's just dying.
Yeah, and Europe itself has taught us, because the European work week, even though some people try to consider it to be a failure and all that, but the reason why the Europeans can focus more on education and so on and so forth is because of that reality that the work week, you know what I'm saying, is not the same.
They have higher productivity with the 6-hour days too.
But we don't have to take Europe and compare to the whole of the US. We don't have to take a particular European country and compare to the whole of the US, because we can take a European country like the Northern European countries and we can compare them to states. We don't have to compare them to the whole of the US. And we can modify
the Union as a whole. We look at the European Union as a whole. Europe as a whole. See,
Yeah.
you know,
we look at it as a whole as an excuse as to why we shouldn't change, as some sort of justification as to why we have a better system. That's basically, where we're at. Why the system should continue as it is. I think we should probably continue in another session.
Inshallah.
But inshallah, because I have to still do some things and it's late at night. But
all right, Sheikh. Well, it was really nice talking with you. I felt like this was a very productive conversation that will benefit a lot of people.
Yeah, inshallah, I hope so. I hope that it helped me clarify some things that I want to go back to and reanalyze. And I really appreciate your time and your effort.
I appreciate you.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.